Tonight, Matt Brender is going to be talking to us about all things Git and GitHub. Correct me if I'm wrong. Oh.
You got it. You got it.
All right, cool. Just go ahead and give us a little more intro on what you're doing.
Oh, sure thing. So what I'm going to go over tonight is my stumbling into GitHub. I have not been developing code for a while, and then I've just made it part of my regular day-to-day practice for a while. I've got the basics down and want to share it with you and just give you some resources for you to get just as active and give you some reasons why it's even worth using or version control at all.
Cool. All right. Just a few notes before we get started here. We're doing some tech talks at OpenStack Summit Paris, VMworld EMEA. You can get in on a conversation. I'll be watching Twitter. Tweet us at vBrownbag, hashtag at vBrownbag, and all of the tags you see following. We are still doing some other brown bags as well. APAC is every Thursday. EMEA is doing the VCP and V series Tuesdays, and all the other letters you can read there. Matt's on Twitter. You can follow him. I'm on Twitter. You can follow me. And that's
I actually recommend both.
All right, cool. Matt's probably cooler than I am, but that's all right.
Get out of here. Get out of here. Don't you?
All right. That's really all I got. It was short and sweet, so I'll let you get started to the good stuff.
Good stuff. All right. Let me show that screen. You guys seeing what looks like a blank screen?
I can, if that helps.
That's about as good as I'm going to get because I can't see the attendees. You're my eyes and ears, Anthony. All right, everyone.
I'll be here.
Thanks for joining. So I want to show you a little about what I've learned using GitHub. So first off, this is Matt Brender here. I'm using a tool I'll talk about a little bit more. I decided to get away from PowerPoint and actually code in order to talk about coding socially. I podcast, I blog as much as I can, and I don't consider myself a developer just yet, but I do hack as much as I can together. I also consider myself a self-loathing marketer. That means I really like technology and think most marketing practices suck, and a huge proponent of doing it well and enabling people to be part of a message and a brand as opposed to just hearing things that are on par and more marketecture than accurate. You can definitely follow me, and I'd love to interact with you on Twitter, but I'm actually going to ignore you right now while I present this unless Anthony says otherwise. So we're going to talk a little bit about version control. Why is version control used at all? Real simple introduction, giving examples from daily sysadmin life, and then get into why GitHub in particular is really powerful as an alternative to the old school version control that you're used to, that I'll show you an example of. And then I really just want to talk about a couple different ways in which you can code with other people. There are two main methods I found that are ways of interacting with people through code on GitHub, and I map out the two of them and some of the social aspects of it because it ultimately comes down to communicating with others, and that's pretty much what I love about it. But I'll also show you what things look like from the CLI, the command line using Git, as well as I have the UI open up here from the website, and then the native app on Mac. So you're going to get a taste of all the things and actually see me stumble through it just like I do when I'm actually trying to code something. For those interested, I'm showing you these slides. This is my slide deck. It's written in YAML, and it's using software called reveal.js. So Reveal consumes this YAML file and turns it into a website that just looks kind of pretty and just ultimately is an overcomplicated way of making a PowerPoint. But you'll see on my GitHub profile and from here that I actually have the folder with the presentation up on GitHub, and this is all active code that I'm using. So we'll edit this a little so you can see the basic interactions. Let's just get to it. Okay. Here is a version of code. You go to the command line, you put -- version after whatever program you're using, and more often than not on a Linux-based system you'll get a version number. So b.1.0.1, real common nomenclature. I'm not going to break down that convention, but just know that if you've seen things like this, it's being version controlled, which is providing a few different things. This is generally how you and I have version controlled, and it's not really a good versioning tactic. So we copy a backup file just to make sure we don't blow away a config on a Linux server or on some web page as we edit it, and then if it seems to work, we just RM that file at some point, or just leave it hanging around forever, which is also very common. And the difference here is pretty profound in a couple ways. That first off, when you use version control, particularly actually any version control system, from Git to Subversion to others that I'm less familiar with, you're creating checkpoints in time, very much like backups. Backups over time of the state that you are in, states that you are sure of, states that you're familiar with. So if the worst comes to worst, you can respond to that problem. So what's really nice about version control in particular is that it allows you to code with other people in a way that prevents you from stomping on each other for the most part. There's definitely a lot of ways in which you still can, but it makes it infinitely easier. And then when you do run into an issue, when you do run into some sort of conflict, you can isolate that down to just a few different commits, a few edits all at the same time. So I just wanted to give that background and context of why we're talking about this at all. So the major factor here to get out of just a single Linux CLI and talk about it from a larger scale is that version control truly enables sharing. So let's think about some examples of sharing at scale right now. Docker. Who is not talking about Docker on the internet right now? If Eric Wright's on here, I know he is. Amongst many more of us. We're all interested about it, but leaving the technology aside for a second, look at these statistics. Docker is heavily contributed to on the GitHub platform, with nearly 2,000 people forking this, making separate copies of it local to them, thousands of people keeping an eye on it, thousands of issues that are being solved and committed and edited, and just massive amounts of pull requests, meaning that this is constantly being revisioned by many people, 400 plus people. Think about OpenStack as well. If I just kind of pulled these stats from Nova, but this is true for all of the pieces that make up the OpenStack puzzle, just massive number of contributors throughout the year, and you can see that it's been forked over 1,000 times. I'll break down what that means, but just basically say every time there's a fork, there's somebody that's editing it and possibly contributing back. Most of them may not all at once, but it's a sign of vitality in that community. And then one more example that I think is pretty cool is that GitHub itself is on GitHub in a meta way, and they have a developer program that actually lets engineers outside of GitHub contribute to their code base. So it's, from what I understand, it's like you get certified, you get blessed by them, and then you have write access to their repositories. Even if you don't have write access, there's actually much of it is just open for use for anybody, so anyone could fork it and edit it locally and use it in their own infrastructure. So when we think about these examples, what it's enabling for each of these companies is an ability to scale their engineering team and quality control in a way far beyond the number of people they could possibly employ at any time. And I find that fascinating. I really think the coding strategies like this are the future. It's also the present, but it's really going to define the future. So I want to talk a little about GitHub and how GitHub is the tool by which you and I and every sysadmin and basically anyone that's willing to take a few hours of their day for a couple weeks can learn and contribute back to this open source community, and also pretty much the internet of everything that will be code based. So here's a little introduction. That's Octocat, the theme animal. I Anthony, would you consider Octocat an animal?
I think so. That's kind of what I always thought of it as, but I guess I never really thought about it that much.
Yeah, there's something for something to ponder. But Octocat is
Cats normally don't like water. They're not. But this, I don't know.
That's what's beautiful about it. It's an enigma. So let's really look at GitHub a little bit. So GitHub, it's made up of a couple things, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify because honestly, I don't know if I am the person that really should give you this intro, but I know it well enough to do so anyway. So Git is a distributed version control system. It's version control, like it makes it easy. It makes it easier to version the code that you're working on and contribute it back to a repository. What's distributed about it is that some alternatives to Git are actually centralized, so there's just one repository that everyone's pushing into. With Git, as you'll see in examples later, it's actually distributed in the sense that there is a source of truth, but then there are local copies of that truth, and they can be merged or pulled against, and kind of each one of them is independent, and it allows people to possibly work at a larger scale than alternatives. I figured I'd give a brief and personal definition of hub as well. It's basically a thing, as not a networking engineer, it's a thing that connects things that produce bytes amongst them. So together, GitHub is code and people. It's kind of more than the sum of its parts, honestly, because it's really awesome to see that there are millions of people who have access to much of the not intellectual property, just the stuff that helps infrastructures and companies of all sizes run in this world. And it's accessible to all of us. So why not play around with it? And in that way, the code out there, it's yours, it's ours. Any of us can just kind of claim it, add to it, and give back in that same way that this community is so amazing at being a part of our lives, that I find GitHub is going to be a place where we contribute more to our community, whether it be vBrownbag or vExpert or virtualization or whatever this all develops into. Particularly the DevOps movement.
So I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So if you
I'm going to just ask you then, Anthony. But what do you want to ask?
Oh, I was gonna say, so I know the answer, but you put your code on GitHub, or it's out there for everybody to see. But what if it's something that you don't want everybody to see? Maybe you still believe that in security by obscurity, or it's just something you don't want to share. Maybe you're embarrassed at your code.
So you're offering a few different situations all at once. Let's pull this up. I'm going to give first off the embarrassment part, because I think that's the most personal thing that that hits us all. Here are my GitHub repositories. Some of them are just totally useless things, like this is the thing I've been using to try to learn how GitHub works, and it's a combination of Vagrant and just junk that I put in here and commit and create conflicts and push around. Am I embarrassed by it? Absolutely, yeah. If you go in looking for code that's going to be useful to your world, you're not going to find it in most of these repos. What I am doing, though, is contributing back in a way that's visible. And when I do get more comfortable, which I have, I try to give back. So actually forked Revelator, which is the tool I use to create this presentation. And you know what? All I did was edit the README file. It's not really much, but I added some documentation on syntax that I think would be helpful to other people. And I pushed it to the owner of this original repository. That'll make more sense with the diagrams, with the idea of giving back to that. So first off, if you're embarrassed by it, get over it. We're all embarrassed as we learn, and anyone that makes fun of you for trying hard and learning is not worth your time. So just give back, work hard, learn, and soon you won't be embarrassed. When it comes to the security angle, that's really important, and I'm not going to shake a stick at that at all. So there's a couple different things. First off, Git is really smart about not letting you upload things that you shouldn't. So if I pull up the Git settings for this directory, I don't have anything in it, but in any folder you have a Git ignore. So you can tell it to ignore certain file types, so that anything that has passwords or anything that has possibly intellectual property, you can ignore that and make sure it's not committed to a repository ever. So you're set there. And then if you're part of an organization, you should absolutely have a private repository. So you can see on here I actually have access to Infinio, my company's Git repository, and that's not a public property because that's our actual IP. So if you're building a product, yeah, you should keep it private, but most of the time, a lot of the things out there in GitHub are infrastructure, are things that are not mission critical, they're not business differentiators in the true sense of building a product. It's just stuff that gets the job done, and the more people that contribute to things that get the job done, the better it will run, and the more you can focus on your differentiator, which is the product you're actually trying to sell. So with that, let's talk about actually using GitHub. There's some lingo that seems complicated that really isn't, and I know I've been saying it a bunch. I'll give one more example, because I was talking about a project at work, and I said, I hope people fork this repository and send pull requests, and my marketing coworker said, I have no idea what you just said. She's like, I recognize all the words in that sentence, but they don't make sense in the context. So what do those words mean? A repository, as I've been talking about, is basically any folder in which you've initialized Git, excuse me. So there are a few files in there that I'm not going to dig greatly into. Just trust that when you initialize Git, it has stuff that will recognize Git. And from that point forward, you can run Git-specific commands, and it will be tracking the changes in that folder. So in this folder, where this presentation is, if I run Git status right now, it knows that I'm on a master branch, which I'll talk about branches in a second, and that there's been no changes to the folder since I was here. Okay, so that's a repository. Then a branch, I think branches are easiest to think about as just different versions of the code. You can branch off from a repository in ways that give you multiple derivations of a code in different states, and that's how releasing ends up being enabled by having a branch that is a given release, or your GA branch is always master, and then you have new features being built on separate branches. But it just gives you a way of breaking things potentially without having all of your code in an unusable state. And then a commit is any time where you've added code to your local repository, and then you're going to basically say, hey Git, remember that these changes that I made, and keep a permanent record of it. So that's really how you start versioning things and start making those iterative changes in a way that prevents you from breaking something phenomenally, because you have little pieces that you can always back out of. And just for context, because you might see it as you read documentation, when you see capitalized head, that's just from very simple Linux-y type feel. It's a symbolic reference to the last commit you went to. You can think of commits just like a timeline, or like a little Turing machine of where you are in your versioning, and head is always where your most recent commit is, and you can move the head to different places so that you go back in time to different versions, and then revert to that change. So in that way, it's actually really helpful to remember that Git doesn't care what type of files you're using. Not at all. It could be anything from YAML to Python to Ruby to text files, as like I was showing you in that playing directory I made. It's just a bunch of crap I throw in there just to practice. But every time you change something, it it's marked as a change. There's a hashing that, again, if you really want to dig into the details, there's plenty of documentation on it, but I think from a functionality standpoint, just know that when you change a file, when you edit anything, it's tracked, it's noticed, and then when you commit, that's your state, and then you can go from there again. So if we go to the command line and think about where we are, if we do a git status, which is the basic command you'll use all the time, you can see if there's been no changes, there's no change to the directory. If we whack at the command line on our source code, make an edit to any of the files that are tracked and not in the git ignore, when we run git status again, it'll tell us that we're still on the same branch and that there are changes, but they have not yet been committed. So that's interesting, right? So we've changed the local file. It knows we've changed the file, but we haven't done anything about it. We haven't actually versioned it in any way. So it's telling us we first need to add it, or we commit it with an add. So in this way, to simplify it, I'm just going to show you, we would do a commit, including an add with a -a, and then we give it an annotation saying what we changed, or else it'll pop up a document asking us to write some sort of comment on it. And I was editing slides, and it said, hey, okay, you edited slides on the branch master, and here's the end of the hash of it, its unique identifier, and there you go. That's what changed. And then we get to a point where we've made edits to a local file, but that doesn't mean anything in that other file out on GitHub itself has changed. And that was probably the most confusing thing for me, that you have a local copy of whatever you're editing that you commit to, but then if you want to keep that and share it publicly, you need to push that. So generally you write git push master or whatever name of your remote is. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So master is where the file is on the server, and since I initialized this repository and I have the link to the exact Git file on GitHub, it knows where I'm pointing to and it just pushes that up there. So now my update would be up on GitHub. But that's pretty, that took me a while to figure out. I'm going to be very honest and say. So I used the UI quite a lot at first. So let me just slide over and show you what that looks like. So here's that slide again. Let's just make a change and say, hey, vBrownbag gang. So I just saved that file. That means that we've changed a file in the directory that's being tracked. I can confirm that on the command line just to show you that, oh yeah, when I run status, it says, hey, this thing has been changed. But I want to show you the UI because I think on Mac and on Windows it's incredibly simple that if we go to whatever directory we're working on and we go to changes, it actually automatically updates saying, hey, we know you changed this file. So I didn't even have to go to the command line before it would recognize that. And I could just commit from here saying updated target audience. I added vBrownbag. So one click, commit. You can see what I just did was I committed that locally again because this is a local copy. So I haven't synchronized to the master branch just yet. And then I commit. Oh, I think I just commit. Whoops, I just screwed up. See, this is how, yeah, I did commit it, and I probably hit the wrong button, and this is very much how I work in this. It's not flawless, but you can see it's stupidly easy nevertheless.
It's kind of the bane of doing a live demo is you always mess something up or, you know, it never goes right. That's just kind of the nature of the beast.
Yeah, but that's kind of what I love about this because I want to show how stumbly I am at it because I've been using GitHub almost every day for about 6 months just trying to work on projects. And I didn't give this background initially that I was trying to learn Python just to build some projects, and I kept trying to get into it, but I was really failing at the basics, and the basic that was holding me back was Git and knowing how to version things and how to like basically use it as a way to talk to others. So I took a huge step back and said, I don't care if I learn Python right now, I'm just going to learn GitHub and how to use it. And even after using it quite regularly, this is about as good as I get. I stumble through it, I make mistakes, I use a bunch of different things all at once, and I don't mind. It gets the job done, and I think that's actually something that is good for other people to see. That's not about being flawless. It's not about being the best person on earth at GitHub. It's just about actually getting it done at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So with that, I'm going to get to more of the details that you'll actually need to know if you do want to contribute and stumble through in the same way that I was just showing you. So there are two main ways in which people can easily collaborate on GitHub. You can either have a shared repository that multiple people have read-write access to, which you can imagine, if you just think of it like a file system, that can be pretty exciting. Or you have the model you'll probably run into much more often, which is that people have just private or read repositories that are public that you fork and then make a pull request on. So for both of these, you've got to remember, and honestly the hardest thing that was for me to remember was that Git always has a local copy that you're working on that you would then push to a remote copy somewhere else. And if you remember that it is both local and remote and that you're negotiating the difference between those two things, I think you'll be in very good shape. So here's kind of a basic workflow that you'll end up doing all the time. You'll write some code that you'll put locally. You'll commit that code locally. You'll push it to the remote branch, and then you'll do that until it's all better and the internet is safe and fixed and there are no more bugs on the planet. So if we add the lingo into that, instead of just saying it in plain language, you add code to the staging area. That's the common phrase that Git and GitHub people use. It was formerly called an index, but it's just your staging area local to you before it's been committed. Then you commit it to your local branch, the repository you have on your computer or your work environment. You push it to the remote branch, and then you repeat. And again, the UI is definitely easier as you're getting used to it, so don't be shy about just popping over and stumbling your way through that. So let's change up the background. I was just playing with this code because why not? And talk about an example of a read-write. So here's a situation. You've got 3 people that all want to contribute and work together on a single project. Let's say that blue person owns this repository. They're the one that that kind of made it in the first place. But since everyone has read-write access, everyone has basically the same ability to edit it at any time. So you can make edits locally, and then you can push that branch to the remote branch at any time. And that could lead to some serious messes, but I'm going to talk about the happy path right now. Let's say that it starts with purple person downloading that by doing an initialization or a clone. That's really easy to do. Let me actually just show you what that looks like from the UI. Let's look at, got a project called, it's a vagrant file for something. I actually even forgot, for Django. I just click clone. It points it to my local directory. I already have it here, but I'm just going to overwrite it. And boom. So now I have that local repository. And the changes since then, you see that there have been no changes. See the history of the changes. These are all the commits that have been made. The branches, I only have one branch. It's the master one. That's the one by default. So that's all it takes to clone something locally. Then, okay, back to purple developer. She makes some local changes, and then she commits that locally, like we know how to do now, and then she does a push to master on the other side, which is a terrible idea. Don't push to master. You should push to some other branch. But let's just say she pushes back up to the original repository. Now, if somebody else wanted to pull that down, like the first person, they would do a pull request, or yeah, they would pull to their local directory, doing a rebase or just a pull to get the changes. And now blue person would have the updates that purple person had sent up to the shared repository. What's nice about that is that all three people can collaborate in a pretty quick timeline, and if they stay coordinated and communicate about what code is going to what branch and what branch has what change to it, they can easily just update it on the remote branch and then pull it down locally. So that works really well in a tight group that's developer-centric, people that are pretty experienced. What I found, I've actually been doing some coding with a friend of this podcast, Virtual Swede, Jonas Roslund, and him and I were sharing a repository and learning the hard way that it's not always a happy path, and we can overwrite each other's code pretty easily. So more often than not, you're probably going to do this. You're probably going to run something where you fork someone else's repository that they're keeping ownership of, and then you send them pull requests when you want them to add your code to it. So let's look at the similar situation. Let's say that blue guy still owns this repository, but these other two people want to contribute to it. Each of them would go into Git and just fork the repository. What that does is basically clone that exact repository owned by somebody else, make a repository for you that is an exact copy of that, and it attributes the version, so the remote of that repository to the original copy. And then you clone it locally, because when you do a fork on GitHub, you just created the remote branch, the remote copy. Now you need a local copy. So let's say purple person downloads it. She does that edit again. She updates it in some awesome way, and she then would do something called a pull request, which is really just one click in the GUI saying, hey, somebody else should, the original owner of this should take that update and merge it into the version that they have. So if blue person owns that original repository, purple person did a pull request, and now the blue person can accept that pull request and actually merge those repositories together. So it's a same result as the first version, but a different workflow where people keep ownership of their separate remote repositories and then merge them together at their leisure, as opposed to immediately on the demand of the developer. It's a little safer, it scales a little bit easier, and is how most of the stuff online is going to work. Anthony, any questions after that?
Actually, no, it's been relatively quiet. I haven't seen anything on the Twitters yet. Apparently, you're doing a really good job.
Or I've dumbfounded everyone.
We'll go with you're doing a good job. I didn't even know there was a GitHub application. I just thought it was something, you know, you had to do from command line.
Yeah. You know what? I had the same thought, and I just personally, I think command line just feels more awesome. Just being part of this tech world. But I'm telling you, when I was learning, it took me a while to wrap my head around this stuff, and I'm not embarrassed to say it. So I used the GUI, I used the web client, and then I slowly figured out my workflow from a CLI standpoint. So back to that lingo again, after going through this branching and forking and read-write repository stuff. So what we just did, we added code to the staging area. We do a local add. We then commit that to the local branch, like purple person was doing. She then pushes that to the remote branch, and then does that again. That repeats it over and over again. And either that remote branch is either going to be immediately written to if they have read-write access, or it's pushed to a remote branch, and then she would need to do a pull request in order for the original person to be notified that there is code that she believes he should accept. That's the happy stream. The less happy stream, when it comes to how this code goes, is a lot messier. So the common workflow I've been running through when I'm sharing code with other people is that first thing you do whenever you're about to edit things is you run a git status to figure out where in the world you are, because if you're sharing code, somebody else probably updated things. You then run something called a git pull rebase, and I'm going to summarize that. There are plenty of resources to dig into this further, but what you're doing is pulling the most recent updates and applying them locally on top of what you have. If you have any outstanding edits, you're actually going to have to move those somewhere else first. That's what the next movement does. So you would commit code locally again, you'd be editing it, and then you can run git stash. Git stash actually puts exactly what it sounds like. It puts the changes to the side so that you're back to whatever the last commit state was. Then from there, you could safely run a git pull again and rebase back to whatever updates happened in just the delta between 2 and 5. Because if you're working with a lot of people, changes happen and you want to make sure to stay in sync. You could then git stash pop and put your changes back on top of it, and then push to upstream if you set that up right. But we're getting down a path where it tends, I guess the long story short is that it tends to be slightly more complicated than I'd like to admit, which is why a lot of people have a struggle of a time when they're first getting used to Git and GitHub. So just take this with a grain of salt, use the UIs and the resources available, and just know that when you're editing by yourself, it really is as simple as this. Just when you start editing with other people, it can get a little complicated a little quickly. So again, to really hit home on what I think is the most important takeaway here is that when you're getting into GitHub, remember that you're doing it for fun. If no one on this line knows GitHub already because they are not they're not developers by nature, or they don't need to use a lot of version control in their current job, then what you're doing it for is fun. Yes, it's career building. Yes, it's for personal development and all that jazz. But just remember to make it enjoyable. Find excuses to use it every day. Like I started writing notes to myself in GitHub as opposed to using like notepads or Evernote for a little bit, just so I had an excuse to use it. And I find, like, when you abstract away the need to both learn coding languages and to learn GitHub at the same time, it gets a lot easier because you're focused. And then be really patient with yourself. I stumbled around like crazy just showing you the basics because it's hard. It's a little more complicated than it comes off as, but then it gets easier with time. And then the third and final advice for enjoying it that I found is really partner up with people. Find another vBrownbag friend or find just somebody who's also developing, and find people online through the different communities we use and share your experience so that you both kind of stumble through together and feel better as a whole. If it wasn't for the vBrownbag community and the friends I've made in here, I absolutely would not have kept working on GitHub because I would just have been embarrassed and died a little bit. But then I realized people way smarter than me have struggled through this and got past it, and you know what, I can too, and so can you, I'm certain of it. So here's some of the good resources that I've run into. Atlassian, which is a pretty interesting company, they wrote a huge treatise on different workflows and what you're doing. They're where I stole, that's the site where I stole all those images of repositories and people committing. So they walk through that in great detail with command line and also annotation on top of that. Git from the trenches is my my savior when I've screwed something up and I have no idea what the error message is. It's just this site filled with really good fixes for really complicated but common problems. There's a great Git tutorial that I linked to, and then for those familiar and not familiar with it, Stack Overflow is a fantastic resource. just a Q&A site for nerds that whenever I have a struggle, I first Google and see if there's a solution on there, and then in the rare case that there isn't an answer already out there, I would actually ask one on there too. So with that, just wanted to thank you guys for listening and watching, and say cheers to my vBrownbag people. And I hope this code is interesting and that you use it, and that the homework gets you a little bit more familiar than you are before.
Awesome. We did have a few things come in kind of towards the end. There's also a Visual Studio plugin for GitHub as well, and they sent the link, and I'm going to send it out in the chat window as soon as I figure out where I put it. I moved it around. The second thing was somebody said, now I see why Alan R. put the vcheck script in GitHub. Virtual does a lot of Power CLI stuff, and he's got some scripts, the vcheck script specifically on GitHub.
Oh yeah. Exactly, because if you get to something even remotely complicated, I wish I had, do I have a good example here? Does Revelator have branches? Oh, no. I'm just trying to think, like whenever you branch out and you're trying to add more features to something that already exists, but you don't want to totally ruin what you already have existing, it's amazing how simple and straightforward it is to create a branch of something so that you have a place to edit and figure out the differences while people can still go to the master branch, kind of your default branch, and know if they download or clone that repository, it's going to work right away. So that way you can iterate simultaneously while you still have a product that people can download. And when you look at the commits and how easy it is to go back and see, like, hey, what did I break or what did I fix? I just find it super empowering, even at the simple way that I use. And so whether you're making little bash shell scripts for work or whether you're trying to build something like a community project, it's really powerful.
Yeah, and I actually used one of my first GitHub projects. I wrote, when my wife and I were getting married, I wrote a wedding RSVP tracker type deal that I made a website basically, Ruby on Rails, and made a web application for family to RSVP it.
Awesome.
Into it. And my first Ruby project, I'm not a developer. That's not what I do, but it was just a fun thing. And I actually had people branch it, and I haven't looked. I'm curious to see, if anybody actually did anything with it, or if it was just kind of junk from them, or junk that maybe they looked at it. I don't know, but it's kind of cool to see that somebody maybe used it.
Yeah. I think that's what's the coolest thing about it, right? And as part of what inspired me when I got into blogging as well, this idea that I write something that I think is sloppy or just like an incomplete thought, and I just kind of throw it out there to see what happens and to see what sticks. And in a lot of those ways, it's just, for me, it's a catharsis to write that stuff down or to contribute it publicly. And then you have people that read a blog post or listen to a podcast or look at your code on GitHub and just say, wow, that was really helpful, thank you. And I think if you hear that enough times, no matter what you're building, when you're building it publicly, you just keep doing it out of habit, because there's nothing more inspiring and empowering than sharing this stuff out. Like here on that same example, Anthony, the blog I have, or not the blog actually, the homepage for myself on mjbrender.com, this one that looks way cooler than I deserve to have from not being a developer. All the code for that is right here, and with credits to those that have actually built it and put it out there for me to download. So just sharing these kind of things, I think, is incredibly empowering and just kind of a really fun part of our culture, and also the direction when you think about career development that all of us should be getting as we think about building infrastructure that scales and is repeatable, and getting beyond all this cattle that we're used to herding in the data center.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. One other question that we had, somebody asked why why would you use Git? And now this is kind of getting into a Vim versus Emacs maybe, but why use Git rather than Subversion or for in-house only teams? Why one over the other?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm definitely not a person that's even considering that. Looking at GitHub, seeing how GitHub is a social platform that I want to contribute to. But to take a step back, when I was doing more research so that I knew what I was talking about on this presentation, I found that Git, what differentiates Git is that it's distributed. This idea that there's no single source repository that everyone else is supposed to check into, and that being the single point of truth. What's interesting about Git actually is that there are local repositories and remote repositories, and that the coordination of them is very much a social construct in whatever development environment you're at. So if I'm understanding it correctly, so it's like the difference between, if we go back to, how do I do that? Escape. It's like the difference between looking at the read-write example, where people are all contributing and it's all live all the time in this one directory, versus the pull or the fork and pull model, where there will be a safe copy somewhere that somebody owns and that other people are cloning locally and editing and then will merge upstream. That's the best of my understanding, and honestly might not be totally true, so I'd leave that to the internet to decide. I'm sure there are plenty of opinions.
Cool. Yeah, and I know I've heard some different arguments, and like I said, I'm not a developer. I don't see it every day in my everyday work, but some people are pretty Git is bad, Subversion is good, or Subversion is good, whatever, vice versa.
Yeah. You know what, Anthony? I think of it like this, if I were to boil it down, that it's like the argument about configuration management, whether you should use Puppet or Chef or Ansible or Salt. The answer is yes. If you're using any form of configuration management or any form of version control, and you're using it in a disciplined way that allows you to very effectively coordinate with others and to version a product that's useful, who cares? Just use the one that you're using and that works. Sometimes you don't need change just for the sake of change.
That is very well stated, and I agree wholeheartedly. Cool. Are there any more questions? Anybody on chat have anything else that they want to ask or talk about, or?
I'll join the Twitters now and see.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't seen anything. I've been looking, refreshing.
Why is the purple person a girl? Because women code too, my friend. Remember that.
Cool. Anything else? Nothing else rolled in the chat yet. We're done a little bit early, but that's all right. I mean, we can stick around and talk if anybody else wants to. But I'll probably stop the recording here.
That makes sense. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you do the homework, because it walks through kind of cloning a repository and then editing it locally. And as you stumble through that, make sure to reach out. Like, always available on Twitter more than any other medium. I'd love to see your activity and know that it's been helpful.
Yeah, Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, Twitter's awesome. It's a great way to just, a lot of people in the VMware world and a lot of other worlds, it's huge communities and people willing to help. So if you're not on there, get on there, because that's where stuff happens. Make sure to watch our, we tweet and you can check the updates on professionalvmware.com. But we're doing this DevOps series, from what I understand, is well into January. We've got things scheduled out. So, check the website, see if there's anything interesting. If you have any developer friends, which I do, and I'm trying to get them interested and see if they want to, check this out, maybe later. All of them are recorded and posted online. So, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. I told my neighbor. I don't think he joined here, but if he's here, he would probably knock on the wall, and he hasn't yet. So That's about all I got. I'll stop the recording. Check back next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.